Welcome back to the Sad Crime Channel. Today we will discuss the story of a British man's marriage to a Filipina, which unfortunately did not end well. Let's travel to the Philippines. I invite you to listen to this case. Stephen Alston Davis was born on March 27, 1970, in the town of Skegness, a seaside town and civil parish in the East Lindsey district of Lincolnshire, England. His father was a technical specialist at one of the Butlins holiday centers, and his mother, Margaret, was the manager of a team of social workers. Stephen had two sisters. When he was 9 years old, his parents moved to Nottingham. Stephen was a cheerful, energetic boy who loved to joke around. However, everything changed when, in 1984, his father had a motorcycle accident and was hospitalized in critical condition. Stephen was only 14 at the time and suddenly transformed from a carefree teenager into a thoughtful young man who did his best to help his mother and take care of her and his sisters. After 2 years of struggling to recover, his father, Joe, unfortunately passed away. A few years later, Stephen's mother became involved with a man named Alan. Stephen quickly became friends with his mother's new partner. They spent a lot of time together and got along very well. Stephen was interested in computer science and spent most of his free time in front of the computer. He was passionate about programming and wanted to pursue a career in this field. After graduating from college, Stephen took a job at a computer company, where he continued to hone his skills. When he was 21, he received a job offer abroad. The company that contacted him offered to triple his salary if he agreed to move to Hong Kong. His family encouraged him to accept the offer. His mother often said it was a huge opportunity for him, believing that her son was capable and intelligent. She was confident he would quickly adapt to his new environment. Most of Stephen's friends described him as a constantly smiling man with a great sense of humor. A close colleague recalled that Stephen told very bad jokes, but in such a way that it was impossible not to laugh. Stephen was also very family-oriented, caring, and sensitive. A friend added that he was also a bit naive and too trusting. While in Asia, Stephen enjoyed partying and found a new hobby. He joined an aviation club in the Philippines and often spent weekends there with friends, as the flight was only 2 hours and everything was much cheaper than in Hong Kong. Stephen was popular with women. Unfortunately, in July 2002, Stephen's mother received a phone call that would change her life forever. At that time, she didn't know that she would spend the next few years analyzing the smallest details, corresponding with private detectives, and talking to various informants. On that summer day, Margaret received a call from Stephen's colleague, Michael. He only told her that Stephen had been in an accident and had died, and then the call was abruptly cut off. Margaret was in a state of shock. Shortly after, she received another call, which only deepened her anxiety. It turned out that her son had been murdered. The man who called Michael was a Canadian who ran a programming business with Stephen. On July 17, 2002, both men were working on an important project at their company's headquarters in Manila. They left work around 10 p.m. and headed toward their rented apartment. When they arrived, Stephen did some more work and then went to bed. Around 10:30 p.m., Michael left to pick up his girlfriend Jennifer from the airport. They returned to the apartment at 1 a.m. and began preparing for bed. An hour later, the couple noticed a light in the hallway and heard footsteps outside their door. Michael thought it was Stephen trying to play a prank on them, so he called out to him. At that moment, 3 men burst into the room. One of them locked Jennifer in the bathroom, while another pointed a gun at Michael's head and asked his companions in Tagalog if this was the right person. When he received a negative response, the men took Michael's keys, cell phone, and wallet and entered the next room, where Stephen was sleeping. Moments later, Michael heard 4 gunshots, followed by the sound of footsteps descending the stairs, and then silence. When Michael entered his friend's room, he saw Stephen's motionless body. He checked his pulse and began CPR, but Stephen showed no signs of life. Michael decided to call the police. He remembered that while waiting for them to arrive, he turned to one of the neighbors and said that it was the work of Stephen's wife, Evelyn. Evelyn Bohal had grown up on the island of Daram in the Philippines. This is a remote, relatively isolated island accessible only by boat. There is no running water, electricity, or sewage system, and the inhabitants live in poverty. Evelyn left her family home and started working at the age of 13. Her mother recalled that the girl was hardworking and kind-hearted. She helped care for her sick father and wove rugs and mats that her family sold. However, Evelyn was determined to start earning money as soon as possible and escape poverty. When she was 10 years old, her aunt asked her what she wanted to be in the future, and she replied that she wanted to work in a bar and meet an American whom she would marry. The journey from Darum Island to Angeles City takes a full 2 days. It's long hours, first by boat and then by bus. This is a city where people primarily go to party. Many young girls, very much like Evelyn, choose this place to earn money, which they then send to their families. Angeles City is known as the sex capital. Girls as young as 12 work there, often lying about their age just to get a job. They earn money by dancing in clubs and also by providing more intimate services. A large portion of the money that clients pay goes into the pockets of bar owners. Evelyn worked in one of these places. Her sister recalls that Evelyn was ashamed of what she did. She would say that she hated her life and often turned to drugs to avoid thinking about how different the reality around her was from what she had imagined. She was also often forced by the club owner to have intimate encounters with clients. Stephen met Evelyn in the very bar where she worked and, one could say, fell in love at first sight. He paid for a night with her, and later gave the club owner £500 as compensation for breaking the contract, so that Evelyn would never have to return to that place again. Stephen quickly told his mother the news that he had finally met a woman who completely captivated him. He admitted that his chosen one worked in a bar, but at that moment Margaret thought it was just an ordinary bar, like those in England, and that Evelyn was either a waitress or a bartender. When she finally found out that in reality, her son had first hired his partner as an escort, she was disappointed. On the other hand, she now admits that most of these young women don't deserve such a life, and that often, it is the only way for them to earn money for their entire family. Stephen himself often told her that he had saved Evelyn, and that he was glad he could do that, at least for this one girl. For Evelyn, Stephen was primarily a promise of a better life. She told her close ones that he was handsome, kind, young, and very wealthy. Although his mother wasn't initially thrilled with her son's choice, when she visited him in Hong Kong and met Evelyn in person, she seemed modest, quiet, and very polite to her. Margaret fully accepted her son's girlfriend, and on March 20, 1997, Stephen and Evelyn decided to get married, in the presence of Margaret and her partner Alan. Evelyn had never attended any school, so she wasn't even able to read the words of the marriage vows. They managed to deal with this problem somehow. The newlyweds invited Margaret and Alan on a trip to one of the beautiful tropical islands, Porto Galera, as part of their honeymoon. At first glance, it was clear that Stephen was madly in love with his newly wife and would do anything for her. Evelyn, however, seemed a bit less invested in the relationship. After returning from their trip, the couple settled together in Hong Kong, and their married life seemed to be going very well. Stephen opened his own company, which was involved in programming, and he worked very hard, sometimes even up to several hours a day, to get the business off the ground. His mother even invested in the early stages of her son's business, making her the main shareholder. In 1999, Stephen and Evelyn's first child, a daughter named Jessica, was born, and 2 years later, a son named Joshua. The whole family then moved from Hong Kong to Angeles City and rented a house in a very wealthy neighborhood. Stephen was earning very well, and the couple could afford a nanny and a housekeeper. Evelyn practically didn't have to do anything at home, and Stephen often said that his wife was his princess. He also gave her £1,000 a month for her needs, and it wasn't just Evelyn's life that changed. Stephen also sent her parents considerable sums, which were used, among other things, to build the only brick house in the entire village. Stephen also funded tickets for them so they could visit every once in a while. Sometimes they stayed with them for a few weeks, and after they left, various items, including pillows, would go missing. However, it didn't bother Evelyn at all that her parents were taking their things without asking. She would say that she and Stephen would simply buy something new, and she saw no problem with that. Eventually, even Evelyn's relatives noticed that she had changed significantly and had started treating them condescendingly. The main topic of conversation with her became money. Margaret and Alan also visited the Philippines at least once a year. Over time, they began to notice that Evelyn had become distant and absent. She was cold towards Stephen and was annoyed by almost everything he did. She was often seen on the side with a phone in her hand and a smile on her face. They began to suspect that their daughter-in-law was having an affair. They weren't the only ones either. Even Evelyn's sister directly asked her if she was cheating on her husband. Evelyn admitted that things between her and her husband were not going well and that she was indeed seeing another man. Her lover was a local security guard named Arnold Adore. He was also married, but his wife eventually left him as soon as she discovered his relationship with Evelyn. Stephen also began to suspect that his wife was being unfaithful. Money started disappearing from their home. One day, when Stephen wanted to take his daughter to kindergarten, he found out that she had never even been enrolled. This was a private institution for which Stephen had given money to his wife to cover the fees. When he discovered that his wife had even pawned her wedding ring, he was devastated. Evelyn had been spending all the money on her lover, buying him expensive gifts, and had even saved enough to buy him a motorcycle. Stephen distanced himself from his wife for a while and threw himself into partying, but he still hoped to rebuild his relationship with Evelyn. Finally, he gave her an ultimatum. He wanted her to return all the money and either get a job or enroll in college. Unfortunately, this didn't change anything. As a result, Stephen stopped giving his wife any funds and threatened her with divorce. Now let's return to the tragic day when Margaret learned about her son's death. As quickly as she could, she got on a plane to the Philippines. Once there, she met Evelyn at the funeral home. However, her daughter-in-law didn't approach her. Later, when Margaret tried to talk to her, Evelyn barely spoke. She only asked if Margaret had already spoken to Michael, explaining that he had probably seen the attackers since they were inside for 20 minutes. Margaret then began to wonder how her daughter-in-law knew how long the attackers were in the rented apartment. This was the first time it crossed her mind that Evelyn might have had something to do with her son's murder. From that moment on, she started noting down every conversation with Evelyn. The autopsy revealed that Stephen had 4 gunshot wounds. The bullets had hit his chest and passed through his body. Initially, the police assumed that the perpetrators only intended to commit a robbery, but something likely went wrong. They then considered the possibility that the attackers were somehow connected to Stephen's business. However, the investigation barely progressed. Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. The police were hindered by procedural and financial issues. Margaret hired a private detective who monitored Evelyn 24 hours a day. It turned out that she was primarily visited by 2 men, her lover Arnold and his friend, also a security guard, Alexander Dagami. Stephen's mother provided the investigators with leads and information about potential witnesses. She even had to pay the police for petrol so they could interview them. She also spoke with Michael, who said that on the night of Stephen's murder, he had tried multiple times to contact Evelyn, but she didn't answer the phone. Margaret didn't have to wait long. Her daughter-in-law quickly started a conversation about money. Evelyn also mentioned that she was having problems with the landlord of the apartment she was renting. When Margaret offered to pay the rent for a year in advance, the landlord refused to accept the money due to complaints from other neighbors who were disturbed by the loud and frequent parties held at Evelyn's place. It became clear that when Stephen wasn't home, which was most of the week since he worked away from home, his wife was partying. It also came to light that when Evelyn and Stephen got married, she had used her sister's birth certificate and information. This was because she was only 17 at the time and couldn't legally marry Stephen. From the beginning, she claimed to be only 5 years younger than him, but in reality, the age difference was 10 years, meaning that when Stephen met Evelyn, she was only 14 years old. When Arnold Adore and Alexander Dagami were summoned for questioning, Michael confirmed that it was indeed them, along with another man, who had broken into his room on July 18th. They were arrested, and at that point the local police and the British Embassy began urging Margaret to return to England, as they believed her life might be in danger from the family and friends of the arrested men. Margaret managed to get permission from Evelyn to take her granddaughter on vacation, but although she wanted to take young Joshua as well, she couldn't locate him. Stephen's mother was exhausted at this point. However, her plan was not fully realized. She only managed to take her granddaughter with her, and not everyone responsible for her son's death had been arrested. The detective who continued working for Margaret found out that her grandson was on Darum Island with Evelyn's family. Evelyn's relatives eventually agreed to hand over Joshua to his grandparents in England for £200 because they were struggling with financial and health issues and realized that the boy would have a better future with Margaret and Alan. They themselves couldn't afford to provide him with any education or even basic care. Despite being on the other side of the world, Stephen's mother continued her efforts to prove that Evelyn had ordered her husband's murder. She spent a total of £55,000 on this endeavor. The breakthrough in the case came, however, thanks to Evelyn's relatives. Evelyn's aunt became very fond of Margaret and Alan. She was in regular contact with them and promised to do everything she could to help them find the truth. The woman noticed that since Stephen's death, Evelyn's brother-in-law had been behaving very suspiciously. When the police tried to question him, he went into hiding. However, the aunt knew where he was, and thanks to her, the third assailant, Robin Butaz, was also found. It was his testimony that led to Evelyn's arrest. According to some sources, the woman already had a new partner and a 2-month-old child at that time. Evelyn continued to maintain that she had nothing to do with Stephen's murder. Robin testified that on July 17th, around 11 p.m., Evelyn asked him to go with her. He didn't inquire about the details, he simply got into the car with her, where Arnold and Alexander were already waiting. They drove for a while toward the capital until the car finally stopped next to a building. Robin, along with the other men, entered the building and went upstairs, while Evelyn waited in the car. It was her lover Arnold who pulled the trigger and killed Stephen. Later, Evelyn informed everyone that her husband was a millionaire and that she would now inherit all his money. Robin was not charged in exchange for his testimony against the other three. Arnold Adore and Alexander Degami were found guilty of Stephen's murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Evelyn's trial began in 2004. She claimed that she had been asleep at her home that night and knew nothing about the events. However, the evidence was against her. Not only did the attackers have a key to the apartment where Stephen was, but also Evelyn's neighbors saw her return home only in the early morning hours. 14 witnesses testified against her, including members of her family who had heard her talk about plans to kill her husband and take his fortune. There was no one to corroborate Evelyn's version of events. Margaret and Alan flew to the Philippines to be present when the judge read out Evelyn's verdict. They wanted to close this chapter in their lives and focus on raising their grandchildren. Evelyn had no support that day. The only person present in the courtroom whom she knew was her lawyer. Evelyn was sentenced to 40 years in prison without the possibility of early release. After the verdict was announced, Stephen's mother wanted to talk to her daughter-in-law for a moment, hoping that Evelyn might confess to her guilt. However, Evelyn continued to insist that she had done nothing wrong. In prison, Evelyn was visited only by her father. The rest of her family had turned their backs on her. Evelyn appealed the verdict, but her appeal was rejected. Margaret and Alan sold their home in the suburbs of Nottingham and moved to Spain with Stephen's children. Thank you for listening to this story. Until next time.